All right, guys, lovely to see you, by the way. All of you, really appreciate it. All right, Rav Kevin, you want to teach us?
Yeah, I'm just getting mixed up. 1 second. Sorry about this.
No, that's okay.
Okay, we did. Okay, yes. Okay, so the next malacha we're going to discuss is kneading. Kneading, not Needing. Pronounced the same way. It was called a homonym in English. Anyway, this will refer Shleima Shifra Simcha Bat Yeta and all Cholim of Klal Yisrael. So kneading. There are 3 prohibitions here. First one, mixing ingredients with a binding agent to form one mass, dough, or paste. B, mixing or pouring a liquid into a flour, powder, or sand. And C, making plaster or cement. So just a practical, if you have pro-nutro and you mix water, it has to make it into a thick paste. That's actually kneading. So you can't have pro-nutro on Shabbos because the process is actually kneading, because you can't just pour water and eat it immediately. It has to be mixed into a paste. So pro-nutro, so practically for our purposes, you can't have something like pro-nutro on Shabbos because the process of mixing it and making it into a paste is called kneading. Okay, so just wanted to make it more practical. So the distinction has been made between a stiff mixture and a semi-liquid one, or a stiff one. A stiff mixture cannot be easily poured from one utensil into another, whereas a semi-liquid mixture pours easily. A stiff dough or paste may not be mixed on Shabbos, even if it is prepared in an unusual way. However, leniency is applied to semi-liquid mixtures, provided that one deviates from the normal method of preparation. For example, when one is preparing a semi-liquid food consisting of powder and milk, and the powder is normally taken first, the milk should first be poured, and then the powder should be added. The ingredients should be stirred in an unusual manner. Instead of using the normal circular movement, one should use a to and fro motion, withdrawing the spoon from the mixture between each motion. Okay, so let's leave it for there. There's still a few more points on this. So it's something that's you have to add water to that makes a thick paste or mixture, rather avoid, because that's I don't know what they did in the temple times, what they actually needed, what material they produced by the kneading action. It doesn't actually say here. It might have been with coloring and making the dyes or making like a paste or an adhesive. They had to go through this process with the materials in order to create it. So that's probably, maybe that's why you can't perform this action with the foodstuffs.
Okay. I've got a question for you. Can you use Kellogg's? Because that eventually turns to cement anyway if you leave it.
Kellogg's?
Yeah, if you leave cornflakes, it's the worst thing to ever
get
out.
Like Future Life, Pro-Nutro, these type of porridges, like a porridge. Let's say porridge. That's or like a maize type porridge. Which
Kellogg's is not like that because it doesn't absorb straight away. You like leave it for a couple hours.
What Kellogg's? Which brand? What type of cereal?
Cornflakes.
Which one?
The cornflakes.
No, cornflakes is fine. You can add it. You eat it straight. You don't have to mix it.
Yeah, but if you leave it for a couple hours, it turns to cement and you can't get it out the bowl.
Well, I guess once it gets hard, that's when you can't touch it.
Then you shouldn't.
No, but you don't eating, yeah. But what
you give it to cats if that happens. You don't eat it because it won't exactly taste like cornflakes.
You're a needy person, then you can't knead on Shabbos. It's shocking. I'm kidding. Yeah, enough.
You should never, Arthur and all guys, you should never have the need to knead on Shabbos.
Damon's face is priceless. Is going, you guys shut up and let me continue.
No,
Damon, start before the conversation gets in.
I'm just picturing our old age home at Shady Pines.
Shady Pines it sounds quite appealing, I'll be honest.
Yeah, listen, anything that's called, Greenland. You know how cold Greenland is. Anything that's got other said name, or you get somebody that's called innocent and they're on crime watch because they've done 3 homicides and gang rapes. Okay, flowers. This is being recorded. Anyway, all right, let's continue. Kevin, thanks for teaching us. I don't know those things that you teach us, honestly. I find it actually on a very practical level.
Yeah.
Actually, I actually really enjoy the different thing where we have this, and then we have the Derech Hashem, and then we have the dry stuff from Kabbalah. It makes it sort of like
eclectic.
Interesting. It feels like you're learning and it's not boring.
It's a good mix, so to speak. Talking about mix.
It's like meeting, yes. It's like meeting. If you go to Shabbos.
Good mix. You can't do this on Shabbos,
Yeah. Okay, so listen, basically we're on the 38th daf, and we finished discussing the issue of what happens if an individual gores an ox belonging to temple treasury, and temple treasury gores an ox belonging to an individual. We're not going to go through that again. I've put you through it enough. If you don't remember, go to the videos, because we don't want to use further time. We're now talking about what happens. You remember there was that part of the Mishnah. If the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. But if the ox of a Canaanite gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox that gored was muad or tam, the Canaanite pays full damages. Now, the thing of it is we have to explain it because it does sound a little unfair. And very unfair. But when you hear the explanation, you'll know that they've justified it. Whether or not you found it fair afterwards is a difficult thing. You're going to have to do it, but they at least did justify it. So how's the justification work? Well, the Gemara basically questions this ruling, because even the Gemara says it sounds superficially unfair. Because if you consider the matter, it's actually difficult. That's what the Gemara says. If his fellow is meant literally, because it's going through the same argument as the Jew and a Jewish person in temple treasury. If his fellow is meant literally, then when the ox of a Canaanite gores the ox of a Jew, the Canaanite should also be exempt. Well, why should the Canaanite be exempt? Well, very simple. For a Canaanite and a Jew are not fellows. Well, generally what we say in terms of fellows is we use that term if people belong to the same company or they belong to the same university, they're known as fellows. So if you want to use it literally, then it's actually an exclusionary term. So what we'll call it is an inner group. So it should exempt not only the Jew from paying the Canaanite, but in essence, the Canaanite from paying the Jew. Because why should one have to pay if it's considered literal and a fellow as an exclusionary term and one doesn't? Okay, so that's the question of the Gemara. It's got to be fair. So if his fellow is not meant to be literally, then even when the ox of a Jew gores the Canaanite, the Jew should be liable. So why should the Jew be exempt? Because if you're saying it's not literal and it's not an exclusionary term, then the Canaanite is liable. Why shouldn't the Jew be liable? I think so far it's fairly straightforward. Now, the major difficulty is, if you remember before, this is the difficulty I have, is that temple, it's meant to be a way that Rav Menashe basically turned around and said, look, what it does do is it prevents you to have those leniencies due to you if you injure a fellow Jew's ox. So which means if it's not exclusionary, the problem is then, just like a Canaanite would have to, the question arises in the Gemara, just like a Canaanite would have to pay full damages to a Jew, why wouldn't a Jew have to pay full damages to a Canaanite? Because that term, his fellow, refers to Tam. And if a Canaanite is not fellow, and that can't be the case. Guys, why can't it be the case?
The question, why can't it be the case? What you talk about, Tam and Muad?
I'm saying that this leniency, when it says, look, if you gore the ox of your fellow, then you sell the living ox and divide its proceeds, and the carcass goes to the damaged party. So there it's referring to two leniencies. You're selling the attacking ox, which is the leniency of half payment damages up until the value of the attacking ox. So both the half payment and the attacking ox in terms of body weight are two leniencies. So we're saying that's the whole reason why Rav Menashe turned around and said that it doesn't exclude you from paying. What it excludes you from doing is getting that leniency if you damage temple property. But it can't be a case. This is the basic point. It can't be the case that if you get that leniency where you have to pay half payment damages if you injure a fellow Jew's ox or kill a fellow Jew's ox, and your ox is basically tame, why should you have to pay a Canaanite who's not your brother full payment damages? Why would you? If that leniency is given where even your fellow Jew doesn't get full payment damages, why would we pay the Canaanite more than the Jew? But if we're saying it's not an exclusionary term, and the Canaanite has to pay the Jew, then the Jew has to pay the Canaanite. It has to be both ways. Or if it's exclusionary, and that's why the Jew doesn't pay the Canaanite, well, why should the Canaanite pay the Jew? That's the questions that arise. So we have to get a bit of clarity.
Okay.
I've explained this in Damon language. I hope it's been reasonable, but I think easier. Yeah. Sorry, mate. What did you say?
I was thinking, the reason why it's different is, especially, we try to keep peace between our fellows, but we don't really, have to keep peace against people who are not our fellows.
Okay, that's a good point.
Because, if you're living with someone in your community, right, you want to keep sort of like on happy terms. But if a Canaanite's not really part of your community or your world, because it's the Jewish world.
Yes, that's a point, but the point of it is there still has to be what the Gemara poses this as a question, because Arthur's right. Then it would make our question even stronger. If your fellow Jew only gets half payment damages because you live with them and it has to be peaceful, and that fellow Jew isn't happy with getting half his money on damage, believe me, why would you be better to the Canaanite? So the question rearises. So let's just go through the Gemara and add some clarity to it.
Can I just add something? Just sure. One comment. Isn't the Torah, surely it's only applicable, the Torah is only applicable to Jews, it's not applicable to the Canaanites.
Okay, so that's a good point. That is a good point. But then the question again arises, as the Gemara says, that's why we don't have to pay the Canaanites, but then why would they have to pay us? How do you have a double rule book? In other words, if it's exclusionary, neither party should pay either, or if it's inclusionary, then it's more at both ways. So we have to find out.
Maybe that was maybe that was the rule of the land at that point. I don't know.
So we're going to have to find out why. We're going to go in the dark. But these are the questions that come up. But Gavin's onto something there, and so is Arthur. That does play a part. All right. So the Gemara says, Rav Abayu said, the verse states, God arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. Okay. Now, I looked at the source, which is Habakkuk, chapter 3, verse 6. So basically, I'm going to share my screen with you. Simply understood, the verse speaks of God's judgment against the generation of the flood and upon the generation that built the Tower of Babel. Just as a matter of interest, this was Rashi's explanation. If you look at somebody says to you, babbling, it means you're making no sense. If you look at the punishment after for the Temple of Babel, when they were trying to rebel against God and they were of one language, God confused them where they no longer spoke the same language. So therefore we have that term in English, you babbling, meaning I can't understand you. That comes from the Tower of Babel. And bamboozled, meaning I'm confusing you or you confusing me. That's Gavin's right. These are all terms indicating that confusion of language. And why did Hashem not destroy them outright for rebelling against him? Do you remember, guys, the reason?
Did not destroy who? The 70 nations?
Yes. They were challenging God. This
were
was
they not
after the flood.
All over the world, were they not? Was that part of that they had to be, and they had to speak different languages? They were dispersed.
That's absolutely true, but it was a kindness. So the reason why God never destroyed all the nations, because he just destroyed them in the flood, is for the first time, that it was like you've got two kids that are planning to do something naughty, but your kids are always driving each other mad and fighting. And this is the first time they seem to be on the same page when they want to drive their parents mad. So in one part, you're irritated that they're doing something naughty. On the other hand, you don't want to destroy them because there's achdut between men to a certain extent, in that they were at least getting on, which didn't occur at the time of Noah. People were taking each other's wives. They weren't listening, etc., to each other. They were stealing tiny amounts, which was called chamas, which is too small amounts to be able to prosecute. But if 100 people steal from your basket, there's nothing left. You can't take it to court. That was the last straw for Hashem. So at least here they were getting on. Although to a certain extent, this issue with Nimrod was a bit of a difficult issue for one reason, is they said when a brick fell, they mourned the loss of that progress, but they didn't mourn the loss when somebody fell to their death. So that to a certain extent was like communism, Rav Mattis Weinberg said, where they sacrificed 20 million of their own people in order to have certain growth. So you're missing the big picture if you think that people are irrelevant to the construct of a system you're trying to build. But anyway, let's get back to the Gemara. I'm going to share my screen and show you where it is.
Screen, I want to say something. You know, when he started to make us speak all different languages?
Yeah.
So he decided to punish us further, making us not understand our wives either.
You know what? I think that started all the way from Adam. That's where the problem started.
Yeah.
Because remember what Adam said? No, you know what Adam said? You remember what he said to God? The wife that you gave me. It's her fault. He said, the wife that you gave me did this to me. The wife
Made me do this. Made me do this.
You were spot on. Well done to him. It's the first guy to identify the woman or a problem. Well done to him.
Yeah.
James, when it came to Tower Babel, men now couldn't understand the woman either. I mean, they started different languages, and now they're going, what are you talking about, honey? What do you mean?
Correct. I think that's the language of men and women.
It's like a hint. Like the dogs are barking. It means get up and go get shot.
Exactly.
Somebody at the door.
Guys, let's get back.
All
right.
Yeah,
this was Habakkuk, chapter 3, verse 6. I don't understand, honestly, how this has to do with the Tower of Babel and obviously the generation of the flood. It doesn't make sense, but it says where he stands, he makes the earth shake. Where he glances, he makes nations tremble. And age-old mountains are shattered. The primeval hills sink low. So I'm not quite sure the link, but that's what the Gemara uses as a source. Okay, so look, it says, Rav Abayu said, God arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. So it doesn't quote the source. It does. In the Gemara on note 4, it says Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 6. But that's not the wording here. So I think there might be a mistake in the Schottenstein, because the term that they use is God arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. There's no mentioning of that in the verse. So for some reason, we're going to have to go with the Gemara's notes and not its reference point. God arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. So what is meant by the term, he saw and released the nations? Released them from what? It means he saw the 7 commandments that the descendants of Noah, including the Canaanites, because we're saying if the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt from paying. So basically the 7 commandments that descended upon Noah, including the Canaanites, that they accepted upon themselves, the Canaanites didn't end up keeping the commandments. He arose and released their money to Israel. So what does this mean? That there's 7 universal laws, the Noahide Code. And Gavin and I learned this in Sanhedrin. Gavin, it's in 56a. You remember that?
Not the pasuk, but I do remember the content.
Okay, so I don't remember the pasuk off by heart. It's in the Schottenstein, so I'm not claiming I've memorized it either. But you remember the context, because they include the obligation to establish a system of laws. Gavin was onto the right track. They didn't. That was part of the problem. If they had their own law system, we might have abided more fairly. There were other prohibitions that they've got. Idolatry is one, sexual immorality, murder, blasphemy, thievery, and consumption of limbs taken from a live animal. Okay, so it doesn't mean that the Jews are free to expropriate the money of the Canaanites. So this isn't a license to steal from them. It simply means that if the ox of a Canaanite scores the ox of a Jew, or the property of a Canaanite might damage Jewish property in some way, the Canaanite is penalized by being required to pay full damages, even if his ox is tam. Why? With regard to this matter only, God released the money of the Canaanites to Israel because they failed to set up courts of law for themselves. Therefore, they're not entitled to this leniency of tam. Does that make sense? If they had a court of law, and I'm going to explain what this means, because there was this verse, okay, where it says, God came from the south, the Holy One from Mount Paran, which alludes to the offer God made to the nations prior to giving Israel the Torah. Okay, He offered them the opportunity to accept the Torah, but they refused it. Now, what I want to ask you guys, what did God mention that was in the Torah that they refused, and specifically why?
With regard to the Jews or to the non-Jews?
The non-Jews.
There's something about stealing and murder. Stealing, they said they couldn't commit to that, and there's a difficult one for them to be able to observe. Would have been a difficult commandment for them to uphold.
Correct. So exactly that. He went to different nations. He said, guys, got a couple of rules for you. Don't murder. No, it's not going to work for us. Don't steal. Not going to work. You can't take other people's wives. Why not? I'm stronger than them. So all these rules that he gave them to keep were not new Torah obligations incumbent upon the Jews. These were the 7 Noahide laws where he asked them to recommit to it. Okay, recommit. Because he gave them to Noah's generation. He gave it to Adam Arishon, actually. Why is it called Noahide laws? Because it's in the merit of keeping these laws that the non-Jewish nations would survive. Because remember, their thievery at the end is what got them wiped out. Their sexual immorality God was not happy with that. But finally, their thievery of tiny amounts where you couldn't prosecute was enough. But all these Noahide laws are self-punishments. Why? Because it's not like you're getting punished only in the next world. It makes a society ungovernable, anarchy, basically. If your life is not protected, your property is not protected, it's a miserable existence. So God said, listen, recommit to the laws I've given you, and then you can partake in the reward of the Torah. And they didn't do so. So because they didn't do so, that actually is what created the problem. Okay, and in terms of the quote, again it said, okay. So let me just see if I left anything else in my notes. All right. So it's in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. Let me see if I can share my screen. Chapter 33, verse 2. He said, the Lord came from Sinai, he shone upon them from Seir, he appeared from Mount Paran and approached from Ribboth, Kodesh, lightning flashed at them from his right. Honestly, guys, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know how this correlates with the 7 Noahide laws or the offering at all. To be honest, this is the source that the Gemara is quoting. But again, I think in the Schottenstein, they must be. Somebody was having an off day here. I can tell you that much. Because their two sourcing to me doesn't make sense. There are other sources in Deuteronomy that talk about offering the nations, as well as the Midrashim, the opportunity to recommit to the 7 Noahide laws. All right, let's go on quickly. So basically, our verse in the Gemara says God's judgment is upon him. Because they didn't keep the 7 commandments, he arose and released their money to Israel, meaning that the Jews were not entitled to steal the money. But however, when their property damaged Jewish property, because they had no courts of law unto themselves, They weren't particularly concerned about the damage they caused, and therefore their punishment is that the Jews didn't have to pay them. Okay? The Gemara answers that really a Canaanite whose ox gores the ox of a Jew should be exempt, for his fellow is meant literally, and he and the Jews are not fellows. So they're saying just like the Jew doesn't pay him, the Canaanite shouldn't pay him. However, as a result of their failure to keep the 7 Noahide commandments, God penalizes the Canaanites by obligating them to pay in full for such damage. Okay?
Can I just mention something, Damon? Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Obviously, I agree with Hashem, and it makes a lot of sense. But I'm just concerned about it being a chilul Hashem.
Okay, so that is part of the reason. So part of the reason, ironically, which we're going to go through in the Gemara, is Hashem wanted the Canaanites to be irritated with the Jews because he didn't want the Jews to cohabit with the Canaanites. Because if they're overly friendly, we've seen from history, like with Moab and Midian, it did, when there were 24,000 Jews, was it 22 or 24,000 that died, Kevin? 24,000 in the plague. And because of that, Jewish men, they need boundaries. The minute they mix with non-Jewish women, there's going to be a problem. So he wanted a certain amount of irritation to separate the nations. That was part of it, and we're going to discuss it in the Gemara. So that's exactly part of the plan, by the way. The Gemara is saying that the verse is fellows meant literally and doesn't exclude a Canaanite. Just let me just see. So I explained that's cited by the Mahashal, Rabbeinu Yonasan, the Rambam, Choshen Mishpat. Okay, it's got a lot of good sourcing. All right. So the Gemara basically proves that the exclusion is not meant to completely free the owner from paying. So we learned that exclusion was the same with temple property. What did we learn? We said that if the temple is owned oxes, exempts the temple from paying a Jew because the Jew is not the fellow of an institution, so too the Jew should be exempt from paying temple property. Rav Menashe turned around and says, no, what it does do is it's exempting the leniency, but not exempting a Jew from paying, because if a Jew damages, he has to pay. So in this case, we've got a reason why there's no payment made. So the Gemara proves that the exclusion is not meant to be completely free the owner of paying. It says, for if it was so that his fellow exempts a person from paying for damage to the temple treasury, let the verse write this phrase, his fellow, with regard to a muad. And we would know that whether the attacking animal is a tam or muad, the owner is exempt from payment. So it's saying that if, when it came to the biblical verse of muad, it also used the term his fellow with regards to the damage, we would realize that this is an exemption that was consistent throughout, not just the exemption laid to the leniency of paying the lesser amount. Okay, so instead the verse states concerning tam. Perforce, it's not intended to completely exclude the owner from paying, but to exclude him from special half payment of a tam. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh therefore rules that one whose tam ox damages an ox belonging to temple treasure. So it doesn't apply today because non-Jewish people have set up courts of law. It only applies as a punishment because they threw off one of those biblical prohibitions about setting up courts of law. What they do in their own homes in terms of sexual immorality and idol worship, etc., is one thing, but not to set up courts of law which would not protect anybody is quite another matter. And that's exactly why they were penalized, because the Gemara basically said if you don't have a law system to protect people, you will submit to our law system, and some of the leniencies are not applicable to you. All right, let's cover some of the Gemara. Did that answer your question?
Partly, but I was referring to all of it, not just to Canaanites or non-Jews. I'm referring to Jews in Israel as well.
Well, you can't count Israel because Israel is run as a secular state. So it doesn't matter what our rules.
They don't follow that.
They don't follow that at all.
But if they did follow it, I'm just saying a loophole would be just to put everything into a company, all the animals into a company. Then
no, because as far as I know, an institution has to adhere to certain criteria. It doesn't mean Arthur, this problem came up because Arthur brought it up, and you guys are thinking about PTY limited with limited liability, etc. But what we were saying there is the biblical institutions that were used for Kedusha had special divine protection because of the Chomer, which Rav Menashe said that if you're going to be good to other Jews, or you're not going to even pay the temple treasury, which is used to serve Hashem. So it's not just a company with a limited liability protection. You must remember that a company opened up with limited liability for a legal reason, and that is that anybody that opened up a business that ran it for 20 years could be susceptible to losing their fortune overnight when something went wrong. That's where you had economic developments like insurance, limited liability, risk management. These were all economic evolvements when society got more complex. So that's different to a divinely protected institution where you had open miracles, where there was things that were hekdesh, consecrated, etc. So obviously laws do change. Okay, let me just go on. So that the first source was saying God released the nations from to Israel. So what does that mean? Jews can't steal from the Canaanites, but if a Canaanite damages a Jew, he has to pay, and the Jew doesn't have to pay him if he damages the Canaanite, because the Canaanite is being punished by not adhering to the 7 Noahide laws. So if a Canaanite converts, or they're prepared to keep the 7 Noahide laws, they get protection. By meaning, if you set up a court of law and adhere to rules, you will be protected by those laws also. Okay? Let me just go on. So the Gemara is giving another scriptural source now. It says, Rav Yochanan said it's known from here. Okay, what do you mean it's known from here? In Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, the verse in the pertinent part, it reads, Hashem came from Sinai and shone forth to them from Seir. He revealed from Mount Paran, from his right hand, the fire of the law he gave to them. So the sages basically expound this verse to mean that before God revealed himself at Har Sinai, he offered the Torah to other nations, to Edom, to Ishmael, to Edom at Seir, specifically Edom, which became Rome, okay, and Ishmael, which became your Arab nations at Mount Paran. He's given them 2 different opportunities, but they refused it, okay, and as a result, he rendered their money permissible to Israel as a punishment. Okay, so it says, Rav Yochanan said it's known from here, God revealed from Mount Paran that he revealed himself to Israel at Sinai after the nations refused his law at Mount Paran. What nations? The rest of the nations. From this verse, we see that the nations were penalized for refusing to keep God's law. This verse is expounded as follows. From Paran, he revealed their money to Israel. What do you mean revealed? Their money to Israel, meaning that they don't have to pay damages. He rendered their money permissible to Israel, okay? And he penalized them by requiring them to pay in full for damages inflicted by their property. They weren't entitled to half payment leniencies. So although a Canaanite is not the fellow of the Jew, if his ox gores the Jew, he's liable to payment, okay? Then the Gemara cites a Bryce in support. This has also been taught in a Bryce. If the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. But if the ox of a Canaanite gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox that gored was a Tam or a Muad, the Canaanite pays full damages. He arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. He revealed from Mount Paran. So the Gemara is asking a question. Look, it's actually quoting 2 verses. What do you need the 2 verses for? Do you remember the verse I quoted before? And this is the second verse. So the one explanation given is that at Mount Seir, he offered it to the Edomites. So Edom is Rome. It's like your modern Western nations. and Yishmael and your Arab nations, he offered it at Mount Paran. So that's the difference, that he's given different opportunities. Okay? So there's another answer given. So the Gemara explains, and if you will say that this verse, he arose and judged the land, he saw and released the nations, is needed for the teachings of Rav Masna and Rav Yosef, and thus cannot be used for this teaching. So we're going to learn the teaching now of Rav Masna and Rav Yosef. But what it's saying is that if the verse is needed for their teachings, you can't necessarily use the verse again for a completely different teaching. So it's similar to a principle, Arthur. Do you remember Gezerah Shava? Do you remember one-way and two-way Gezerah Shava? Explain.
Got to think now. The Gezerah Shava, if I remember correctly, hold on, my mind's gone blank for a second. Blank now, bro. I just can't. I know it. I just got to try. Give me a second. The one where, okay, I think it's coming back now. Where, it keeps slipping in my mind. Hold on. I have it, then it goes. I'm losing my mind. Just my brain's blanking out here.
Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, I can help.
Sure.
So a Gezerah Shava is when there's superfluous words.
That's it, yes.
And then you link the superfluous words, and then you restrict it by dayu.
Wasn't it, if I remember correctly, the Gezerah, I'm losing it.
I know thinking it's not a hekesh. It's not a hekesh.
No. The one is to do with specific, and then a broader one. Like an example would be a specific one would be the ox, okay, and the goat. Another one would be the other Gezerah would be the ox and all other animals.
Okay, so Arthur is onto something. Well, and so is Gavin. So what we're saying is, what do we mean by superfluous words? If they're at a depth where you're using words that can, if you remove those words, will not alter the meaning or the construct. And you find these similar words that are very unusual in more than one place. It's coming to teach you a different principle. Meaning, I'm not just talking about a word like the. The is meaningless. I'm saying if you say the red ox, the red heifer, etc., and you see it in two places, if it's free, what do we mean by free? If you remove it, the sentence doesn't make sense. It's not free. What it can do is teach you a Kabbalistic idea if it's found elsewhere, where the two ideas are linked, but you can't derive halacha from it. If it's free, meaning it's not going to alter the context of the verse, meaning it's allowed for another reference, and that other reference is allowed, meaning by changing that other verse that's got a similar those identical words, it's not going to change the meaning of that other verse. It means that if you use the combination of verses, you can derive halacha. If it's only available on one side, meaning that the one you need the word to explain the pasha, but the other use of that identical word you don't need the word and it's free on one side. There's an opinion that it is a halacha, but logic can refute it. But if it's free on both sides, it means that it's halacha and logic. Even if you come up with a logical explanation, you have to listen to the halacha. Okay.
So if it's one-sided, it's logic can trump it.
Yeah.
But if it's double-sided, you can't refute it regardless.
Yeah, but not our logic, the rabbi's logic, meaning that there might be certain circumstances where it could be, as you said, trumped or overruled. So what we're saying here in a very simple nutshell is that if these verses were used by these two great rabbis for something else, it's not free to derive a halacha from it. So we need to see what's going on here and see what the case of it is. So, what did Rav Masna and Rav Yosef teach us? So it's saying that the reason you needed two verses is as follows: is that if the verse was used by both of them, you'd need another verse to prove it. Meaning the concept we adhere to, but then you'd need some free verse to make sure that if the principle is reiterated, it can be applied as halacha. Also, you must know that when we quote things like Habakkuk and things like that, or Jeremiah, those are not halachic constraints. Do you remember about when we learned about the tooth and the horns that gorge, etc., etc.? These are concepts that we can understand language, and we can understand a reference point, but halacha can only be derived from Chumash. Okay, so the Gemara goes now on a slight tangent, and it says, look, it needed two verses. He revealed from Mount Paran, which teaches from Paran he revealed their money to Israel, and then he arose and judged the land, was a separate verse. So basically, the Gemara identifies the teachings of Rav Masna and Rav Yosef. So what's the teaching of Rav Masna? For Rav Masna stated, he arose and judged the land. He saw, etc., Vayatar, the nations. What did he see? He saw the 7 commandments in which the descendants of Noah were commanded and which they did not keep. In punishment, he arose and exiled them from their land. So Rav Masna understood the word Vayater as referring to the exile of the nations. Okay? Because what did the verse say? Let me see if I can share it on my screen. All right. So too with Avim, who dwelt in villages in the vicinity of Gaza, the Kaftorim who came from Crete wiped them out and settled in their place. That's the verse. Honestly, I have no idea what the reference is. It doesn't, to me, logically, I don't get it. But anyway, so it says, the verse that states that Avim, the Philistine tribe, and that the Avim dwell in open cities until Gaza, their Kaftorim, who came from Kaftor, destroyed them and dwelt in their place. And similarly, it stated regarding the Horites, and in Seir, the Horites dwelt previously, and the children of Esav will drive them out and will destroy from before them and will dwell in place. These are two examples of nations driven from their homelands. The same occurred to many nations. So what the explanation is given here by Rashi is that Rav Masna teaches that this was a penalty for nations' failure to heed the 7 Noahide laws. So how could this be explained? By one of two ways. Either it's a punishment that they were driven out their land for failing to adhere to Hashem's laws, or it's a consequence. It's not a punishment. So what's the consequence? Is that if there's anarchy, you can't keep a country stable, can you? If people are stealing from each other, how are you going to have a military that cooperates? How are you going to protect your land? How are you going to have government taxation distributed to hospitals? You're waiting to be taken over. There's no protection, not from God and not from other people, because you can't organize yourselves properly. So in punishment, he arose and exiled them from their land. Rav Masna understands the word Vayater is referring to the exiles of the nation. So the Gemara basically asks, and where is it indicated that the word Vayater is a term that denotes exile? For it is written, Vayater the nations, and it is written there regarding the flying shiratzim that one may eat. So what's this flying shiratzim? Well, you know what a sheretz is, oh?
Like a
animal.
Tame creature.
Yeah, the creatures, the 8 different creatures.
Correct. So all winged swarming things that walk on 4 shall be an abomination from you. But these that you may eat among all the winged swarming things that walk on 4s, all that above their feet, joint legs to leap on the ground. So we learn from there, of these you may eat the following: locusts of every variety, all varieties of board locusts, crickets of every variety, all varieties of grasshoppers. It says, of these you may eat the following. So that's a little bit weird because a sheretz generally makes a person impure, makes them tameh. So there are two species of grasshoppers. Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi is saying that the Yemenites still eat them because they know how to.
We shouldn't eat them now, but I think there's a decree against it now because one can't distinguish even in the modern era.
Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi said there are certain Yemenites that can. Goodness knows what the appeal is, but there is appeal apparently. So the thing of it is, so what's this thing talking about, and what are the sharatzim? So basically, it's a spiritual classification for creatures that move close to the ground, reptiles, rodents, like even certain amphibians and insects.
Not insects.
No, it says here.
So I'll consider sharatzim. Okay.
So some of insects are. It's in Vayikra chapter 11, verse 21. It's generally forbidden to consume them because if they did, they contain tumah. But this verse that says you can eat them are speaking about certain flying sharatzim that are permitted. Okay, so how does this relate to the Gemara? Is basically to jump with them upon the earth. It's talking about grasshoppers that can jump. So it's using this word with regards to grasshoppers. So it's using this word, lanater, basically connotes jumping from place to place. So it's used for this jumping or exile of nations from one place to another. So whenever you see that word, it refers to jumping. So when it says nations jump, it means they're booted out. They have to jump ship. Okay? So now we need Rav Yosef's exposition because we know Rav Masnez. Rav Yosef stated, he arose, meaning Hashem, arose and judged the land. He saw, etc., and released the nations. What did he see? So basically, he saw the 7 commandments that the descendants of Noah accepted upon themselves and which they did not keep. In response, he arose and made the commandments permissible for them. In other words, he released the nations from the commandments, from the obligations. Okay? So this is in the Gemara Avodah Zorah 2b. So guys, you must, if it means the nations are no longer obligated to fulfill the 7 universal commandments, you got to have a question or two here. There's got to be something wrong.
Yeah, I do. Massive questions.
What is it?
So firstly, because I mean that's the whole purpose of the 7 ayat laws is that if you're non-Jewish, that's what you're supposed to follow. And now they're saying that there's no obligation, which means they can do what the hell they want.
Exactly. So Gavin's exactly right. Is that the problem is like they're being rewarded. So like God's saying, you know what, you don't feel like the responsibility. That's cool. I'll release you from your responsibility. So they're kind of being rewarded for rebelling because they're not being punished. I mean, if you're released from your responsibility, like why you won't be punished, so you might as well rape, pillage, and plunder to your heart's content. Why not?
Absolutely.
So that would seem problematic. Your other problem that you've got is that, well, why everybody's in this world for a purpose. So that purpose is to elevate your soul. So if you're not obligated to do anything, why are you here?
Yeah, there's no purpose.
There's no purpose. So that can't be what it means. So the Gemara says, but it emerges that they have gained their misdeeds for their sins have freed them from obligation and punishment. Okay? By rights, the transgressions of the nation should have earned them punishment. Instead, what we see is the transgressions caused God to remove the obligations from them, which means they now may sin without being punished. It emerges that the sinners have benefited from their sins. This is the question Rashi is asking. Okay?
So now has Hashem, can I just interrupt? Has Hashem taken the responsibility away from the nations, or is he taken away from the people themselves? Or both?
What are you saying on a macro level, the nations, but not of people individually?
That's what I'm guessing. I'm guessing.
So what I was going to ask you is as follows, is that nations are made up of people. So how can you say that, I'm just asking you a question, how can you say that nations aren't responsible, but that people aren't if nations are made up of people? If you want to say, you can say the other way around. What you can say is people are responsible, but I'm not responsible for my fellow person. I can't help it if he murders. Okay?
Yeah,
And
100%.
then the answer to that, I would think, is Noah. Because Noah is described as a tzaddik in his generation. He was saved because, compared to the rest of the generation, he didn't sin, and Hashem merited to, Noach merited to be saved, but he was also criticized because he didn't stop others from sinning. It took 120 years to build the ark. And the whole reason it took so long is because people were meant to be curious. Who's that crazy old man building a boat? He keeps saying there's going to be a flood. He was meant to do kiruv, and he didn't do kiruv. And therefore, because he didn't do kiruv, it means that's a proof that we're responsible for others. That's your proof. So both ways. Gavin, I might be wrong. I'm just giving you a thought in mind.
No, your point's correct. I just said it. I was just kind of taking a chance out there to try and work it out. And you came back with a good answer, which is, I hadn't thought it through 100%. So well done. It's correct.
So, if so, we find that the sinner has profited from his transgression. This cannot be. That's what the Gemara says. So the Gemara explains Rav Yosef's teaching. Mar, the son of Ravina, said that even if the nations fulfill the 7 commandments, they receive no reward for observing them. It does not, however, free them from punishment if they transgress. Thus, their release from obligation represents no benefit. I'm going to explain it, then I'm going to take questions. So, what does this mean? So, the Gemara answers that Rav Yosef simply means to say that the nations, since they no longer commanded to keep the 7 universal commandments, no longer receive reward for keeping them. However, it doesn't mean to say that they receive no punishment, rather that if they transgress the 7 laws, they're punished according to Rashi. But the sinner has no way in profiting, because in the contrary, he was subject to punishment but eligible to reward. Now that he's free of the commandments, if he keeps them, he's not fulfilling Hashem's commandment, and he's subject to punishment and ineligible for reward. So let me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Example like is a non-Jew that tries to keep Shabbos. They actually get to punish. They're not allowed to. Same thing, eh?
Yeah, but that I can understand a little bit more
different.
than this. I'll tell you where there's a difference. This bothers me. It might bother one or two Meforshim, and we're going to just see there's a discussion on this. Why this should bother you is that's not fair either. Because what you're saying is a person comes here to this planet for a purpose, to overcome the Yetzer Hara. So if you sin, you're going to get punished. But if you're going to put no Olam Haba, then why be created? Why come here? If there's only a losing game, why come here?
No, he was better off. I'm just doing a devil's advocate thing. He was better off before when you said that there was no upside or downside there. Now the fact that there's blatantly just the downside and no upside is even worse.
It's terrible. So not everybody agrees with Rav Mar, the son of Ravina. In fact, Rabbi Meir is a contrary opinion, because it's extremely difficult to understand that those who aren't commanded to keep the 7 commandments can be subject to punishment if you transgress them. In other words, God says to you, a person, they're free. They're free of these things. So how can they get punished? That's your first problem. Okay? So the Meramai Sadeh explains the following. He says punishment for sin isn't, as most people imagine, a divine response to one's misdeeds. Rather, such punishment is a natural law. Just as the law of nature decrees that one ingests poison will die, and one who leaps from a high place will fall to his death, so too its decree suffering upon one who sins. The punishment is automatic. God does not respond to the specific sin. Thus, even if the nations are not specifically commanded to keep the 7 commandments, they still suffer if they fail to do so, For these commandments and the contingent penalties are part of the fabric of creation. There is no escaping them. Okay? So what he's saying is something different. He's saying, look, this is a consequence. It's not that God punishes you for murder, but if you're in a society where everybody murders and steals, you're not safe and your goods are not safe and your wife isn't safe. So that's a natural consequence of anarchy. It's not God punishing you. It's within the fabric of creation itself. It's a consequence. It's not a divine punishment. So he's of the opinion it's not a spiritual punishment. It's a consequence in this world. Okay? Rav Mar, the son of Ravina, doesn't feel that way. He said it's a divine punishment. But the problem that arises is if you're free from your obligation because you're released, how can you be punished for something you're released from? And more towards it, if you keep those laws, why don't you get reward? So there's only a down game. So we're going to hit this issue. Just want to add one or two things. So you've got another question. So if the universal commandments, when we say the universal commandments, we mean subject to mankind, has to be heeded because it's in the fabric of creation. Why did God initially command the nations to keep them? So Meir Sadeh explains that God issued commands because of their reward. Basically, God wishes to encourage mankind to act in their own best interest by keeping the 7 laws. So he promised reward to all those that would keep the commandments. But when he saw the nations had forsaken the laws, he released them from their obligation. But by doing so, he nullified their reward. The nations remained, however, subject to punishment. Okay, so there's a problem with this.
So can I also add something?
Yeah.
Is it possible that the individual, even though he's released from this whole responsibility, can he just take it upon himself to adhere to it and then get the reward because he's taken it upon himself, even though, so the one, because it doesn't say that he can't do it, it just said he's released from the obligation.
Okay, but the problem is when he's saying it's released from the obligation, it's saying as follows. Let me just give you an example. Women are released from time-bound obligations, okay? They don't have to daven 3 times a day, etc. But their reward for, in certain sources, is not the same as men because when you're told to do something against your will, you're very irritated naturally that you've been commanded. And therefore, because your Yetzer Hara is having a battleground for it, it's in that particular case, and we see this with Adam Arishon, God said, don't eat from that fruit. And what's the first thing he figured out? And she figured out, why not? Sounds good. Maybe it's tried. Maybe I'll be equal to God. So all of us, our Yetzer Hara works against what we commanded. That's why there's such a big reward. But when you decide to take something on, like almost an initiative, it's not as much of a reward because it's spontaneity. It's far harder to live with somebody for 20 years in marriage and put in effort when in fact sometimes it's not like you're first in love and you want to take them out and treat them to a holiday. You've got to live with this person for 20 years and sometimes you're doing what you want to help them even if you don't feel like it. In other words, the romance is gone. Once you've been commanded, the romance is gone. You're doing it out of an act of duty and you don't feel like it sometimes. You really would rather do your own thing. But it's an act of subservience which has a higher reward than an act of spontaneity. So any sort of mitzvah, they're saying that, and this is going to be Rabbi Meir's argument, and we're going to hit this tomorrow. He's saying that the non-Jew, in fact, you can't say that a non-Jew doesn't get reward because we're going to learn sources that he brings that a non-Jew does get reward. But what he's saying is that a non-Jew doesn't get the reward that he did because he couldn't keep it. So when he couldn't keep it, he's released from it being an obligation. So if he keeps it, there is reward. But there's not as much reward as if it was an obligation and he still did it against his will. And Jews that are doing mitzvahs that are against their will, in the sense that you're not always in the mood, because they're adhering to the commandments and they're not kicking against it, there's far greater reward than the spontaneity that a non-Jew has when it does certain acts of kindness. So they get reward according to Rabbi Meir, but not the same had they just followed Hashem's instructions. Because it says in Kohelet, all that I ask of you is to fear me and to follow my laws. That's what it says. Not that you love me, not that you doing it out of things. Just do what I tell you to do. And therefore, that sort of thing. I mean, look at the Shema. Look at the punishments we get if we don't adhere. The land will be desolate. You'll be thrown out the land, etc. But there is rewards. But the rewards are only there if you can hold up to that responsibility. Let me give you one analogy before I leave. You're given the position to be a director of a company, and that they found you just not capable of it from going up the ranks. So it's there's a principle by Peter, I think it's Peter Drucker in the Circle of Innovation, which says you get hired up to your level of incompetency, meaning you keep getting raises and new positions of responsibility until you can no longer cope with the elevated state. You've got everybody incompetent in their current position, because if they were competent, they'd get up a level. So that's the irony. So the irony is that the person couldn't take on the responsibility maybe of running 40 employees. He's not capable, so he's released from it. But now he's complaining he's not earning that salary of a director that has 40 people under him. And what the CEO is saying is you can't. If you can't have the responsibility, you don't deserve the salary. And what do we mean this reward? Is that if he comes to the CEO in a lower position and says, listen, I've got a good idea for these 40 employees, he might say, listen, I appreciate that idea. You've got job security. That's your reward in your current position, because I appreciate that you're loyal to the company. And I love these ideas. But you're still not capable of being elevated to that stage where you could earn that 7-figure income. I don't know if I'm explaining it decently.
No, you are. You are. Just practically, unfortunately, people sometimes, there's a glass ceiling or women, and there's a ceiling also. Some people just can't get ahead, even if they are competent. But that's that's got nothing to do with this. That's just
no, that's different. What we're talking about is you only hire to the level of your competency.
Yeah. No,
like
it's a
my
really
brother's
good point.
got close to 300 employees, and I can tell you honestly that I couldn't do what he does. I know my limits. I know I can have a few people working for me. I know I can make money, but that's it. That's it. And therefore, he might earn a lot more than me. He's got a lot more obligations, a lot more pressure, a lot more overhead. But if he earns 100 times more than me, he's got a capability which I don't have. And yet I can't bitch that I'm not earning what he's earning, because I can't do what he can do. And that's all we're saying here, is that if they couldn't keep the 7 universal laws, they can't get the reward as if it was commanded. They're not up to the challenge. So they do get reward for the effort. But it's spontaneity that they get rewarded for, but not adherence to that responsibility level. That's what Rabbi Meir says. He doesn't agree with Rav Mar, the son of Ravina. We're going to see where he's sourcing his Rav Meir tomorrow. But guys, I hope this is good. I spoke a lot in my own words, even though I read the Gemara. I hope that colloquial explanation is okay.
Yeah, super. Thank you.
All right, guys, lovely to see you. Lovely to see Arthur for the while.
Tomorrow 6:30, Damon.
Yeah, sounds good.